Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we have the privilege to be joined by Rabbi Pesach Sommer, who is going to be teaching a tshuva from the HaShatz tshuvos Melamed L'Hoil. I believe it's our first one on the podcast, so you'll tell us a little bit about Rabbi Dovid Tzvi Hoffman and Melamed L'Hoil in just a moment. Our topic today is we're going to be talking about the question of whether a tzibor, a congregation, is allowed to do away with the chazin's repetition of Shmona Esrei with Chazaras HaShatz and its implications for tefillah, for prayer, and for just general relating to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and how we go about that. Rabbi Pesach Sommer is a veteran educator, more than 20 years, is a member of the Judaic Studies faculty and a coordinator of spiritual development at the Ramaz Middle School in Manhattan, which is, I see that's where you're seated right now. Rabbi Sommer is a graduate of Queens College, where he studied psychology and has smicha from Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg. Rabbi Sommer is also a writer, blogger, and accomplished speaker. Its versatility allows him to speak on topics as diverse as biblical criticism, Hasidic thought, and its ramifications for modern Jews and losing and regaining one's faith. He lives with his wife and 8 children in Passaic, New Jersey. And Rabbi Sommer, I know we've corresponded so much over social media. This is, I guess, getting closer and closer to the in-person. We should be Zocha very soon. But thank you for joining me today, and thank you for joining our listeners. So I think if you can start off and just maybe tell us what interested you, what's the shaila we're dealing with? I know I mentioned a little bit already, and what interested you in this particular topic?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Rabbi Kurtz. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as you mentioned, we're going to be learning from Dovid Tzvi Hoffman and Melamed L'Hoil. This is from Orachaim, and it's Siman Yud Beis. I can speak Sfaradi or Ashkenazis, but I guess I'll go with
you can choose whichever one you want. Just to face the microphone on your screen, we'll hear you with the most clarity possible.
Right. So this is actually part of a number of tshuvos. It's Siman Yud Beis, where he was the way it's written. Badak lan mar eich lahashiv lemachadshim be'edasik bekama dvarim shrotzim bechidushim. Right. So basically, I don't know who it's written to. It doesn't say, but he's basically being asked. There are these machadshim, and I think it's important to remember of Dovid Tzvi Hoffman. This is probably being written late 19th century, early 20th century, dealing with still within Germany, within Berlin, the whole world of reformers, trying to make changes to the way things are traditionally done. And so he's being addressed with a whole bunch of changes that I'm guessing probably someone within an Orthodox shul wants to make. And this Rav feels that he has to sort of figure out how to respond. I'm guessing that he doesn't want to do it, but he needs halakhic backing. And then there's a whole bunch of different ones. We're just going to look at the first one, which, as you mentioned, is about whether or not Chazaras HaShatz is still necessary.
Right, and I assume the mechadshim here is not referring to those who write chidushei Torah. It sounds like, as you said, it's referring to those who want to reform the religion.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, just to clarify that. So the question is doing away with Chazaras HaShatz. So this isn't a particularly new question. I think he references the tshuva of the Rambam. Going all the way back to the Rambam, he already was asked about this necessity. And I think if I recall correctly, in the tshuva of the Rambam, there was he said there was so much talking going on in shul that we were losing the whole purpose of Chazaras HaShatz altogether, because people weren't even listening in the first place.
Right. I think that Rambam is very popularly known because I think there are a lot of people who, for all sorts of reasons, some of which Dovid Tzvi Hoffman alludes to here, want to make davening shorter, and so it's sort of like one of these things that are very handy or maybe convenient to know if you're trying to make the argument for why or how to cut down on davening.
Well, another trope that you see is that they say, well, we see that the Sephardim seem to be able to cut it down, so why can't we do it? And this is, I guess, just one of many examples where Ashkenazim are looking over their shoulders saying, geez, why can't we be like the Sephardim? Of course, it only when it comes to the leniencies and not to the stringencies. Of course, the slichos is probably the most common example of that. Who wants to get up for chatzos? Okay.
Right, exactly. I mean, I always find it interesting when, I mean, at least the Rambam is obviously the Rambam, but I find sometimes people know Sephardi Rabbanim literally one sock that they made because they said something that they actually wish they could take on. So you find some Sephardi Rav literally don't even, barely know how to pronounce his name, have never seen his sefer, but he says what I want, and that's good enough. I've got someone on my team. Let me know, and so that's sort of essentially what he's sort of dealing with over here. Is that I mean, you don't get any more Ashkenazi than Germany. I mean, it's literally Ashkenaz, and yet all of a sudden, they're so but the Rambam said you could do it, and I think that sort of. That's thing. I think, in theory, if this was a different time, a different Shaila being asked, there could be a different discussion. But I think the fact that he is responding specifically to Machadshim, I think that's really essential over here. This is not just about, a particular halachic point, but sort of, a much bigger thing, which is one of the things that, I mean, it's been a long time since I became interested in Rav Dovid Tzvi Hoffman. He's very well known for his pushing back on biblical criticism. But I've always loved Shilas and Shuvas. Excuse me a second. As you mentioned, we're in a school, so that's the bell. Maybe a little background noise.
Oh, we don't even hear it.
One thing I love with his Chuvos is that he's right there in the trenches. He's dealing with sort of reforms already established by now. It's not like it's right at the beginning. But it's clearly these things that he's dealing with. He's getting like wild child. I remember years ago when I was in Kolo, there was one, this couple, they were supposed to do chalitza, but they wanted to get married. And the question is, could they do yibum even though you're not supposed to do yibum? I mean, crazy shilas, but things that were really coming up, and they're very real, and they're very, sort of, he's right there in the trenches. And so I think that in this tshuva, it's very, very clear. Almost, they're sort of, okay, I'll address it halachically, but then I'm going to address it hashkafically, because this isn't really just about, okay, looking it up in the sources and finding yes or no.
Yeah, I think that point's really well taken, which is kind of the social context of the tshuva. It reminds me a little bit, if you ever saw that sefer, Yom Tov Sheni Kehilchasa, which was written, I think, by Rosh Kolo in Texas. You'll forgive me if I'm forgetting the name, but it's easily searchable on Otzer HaChachma. So he has a whole nice section in there where he marshals all these sources in support of Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galios and in maintaining it and not doing away with it. And it's he quotes a few sources, maybe it's the Marshal or it was something of that nature, which said that, well, it would have to be later than him, I suppose, that basically that there were those who were trying to reform Judaism, and Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galios kind of became a flashpoint for one of the debates between the traditionalists and those who wanted to reform the religion. So many times what happens, like what you're saying is that you could have what is maybe a technical halachic issue that in any other context, if the stakes weren't as high, maybe we would even see those on the more conservative end being a little bit more flexible on halachic technicalities alone. But what you're saying here is that he sees this as a flashpoint for defense of the broader institution of our religion. And that's where the stakes get very high.
Exactly.
Right. But he does actually raise some halakhic arguments as well. So what I'd love to do is maybe you can summarize for us. On my end, when I went over the tshuva, I counted I think 5 different arguments he makes, but maybe you had a different count, and it'd be interesting to compare notes. So what's his I guess his psak is, like you said, is that he's going to try to defend our halakhic institutions, and I'm curious, what are his defenses that he marshals?
That's an interesting thing. There's really 2 parts. There's 2 paragraphs, and they really are 2 different things. The first one is halachic, okay? It's sort of essentially like he's saying, you want sources, I'll give you sources. That's what a tshuva has to have. It's not just for me to share my thoughts. And then there's the whole second one where he's going to say, okay, I gave you the Makoros, but now let me tell you what I'm thinking about over here, more than just yes or no. But initially, as you mentioned, I didn't. I didn't count in terms of sources, but he starts off. He quotes Rav Avram Emden in the Sefer Tzur HaChaim, and he says that there it says it's very clear that there is a chiyuv to say Shmona Esrei B'Lachash, to say the quiet Shmona Esrei, and you see it's really, he keeps on using this term hamachadshim, and it says, and he pushed away what the machadshim say. And not only according to the Rambam, they're quoting the Rabbi, also Sephardi, and he basically says Rav Avram Emden pushed that away. And then he says, I don't know who this Rav Berliner is, Rav Aleph Berliner. He says, even if you want to say about the Sephardim, you're trying to do away with everything, and they only do it by Musa. And he says, so that's his second argument, that okay, even if you wanted to do it, you're pushing it too far.
Like Dio Lovim and Adin Lios Kanidon. You can't learn more than what the origin that you want to learn from actually supports.
Right. And then he says, okay, but fine, but that's Sephardi, and we can't change our minhag. Essential thing, which often comes up in these kind of things that we're talking about. When you were saying before about sort of what is sort of couched in halachic terms, but is often about a lot more. I often think of kitnios, and where there's a big difference. Okay, so you want to stop keeping kitnios, but don't pretend this is just a halachic argument. And that's what he's saying. In other words, okay, great. Okay, there may even be precedent among the Sephardim, but we're Ashkenazi. We have our minhagim, and it doesn't work this way. This is not the way the halachic process works.
Right. So his first argument seems to be that of minhag and that of halachic formalism. What I found interesting also is it looks like in my version, 2 lines down from there, he quotes the Magen Avraham regarding piyutim. And he mentions that because, especially in Ashkenazic liturgy, we developed all of these additional piyutim and, prayers in order to flourish and enhance the davening and the Shemona Esrei in particular, one might not actually be Yotzei their Shemona Esrei because of the piyutim that are interspersed in the Chazaras HaShatz during Yom Tov, and even if it's done on Shabbosim, which is very interesting because if it's so much of a hefsek that I wouldn't be Yotzei by listening to the Chazan say it, then why are we putting piyutim in the Chazaras HaShatz? Wouldn't that be a hefsek vis-a-vis his Shemona Esrei as well? It's I'm curious in general, just piyutim in general has always I imagine, for our listeners who don't know a little bit about our background, Rabbi Sommer is I think you're someone who's very passionate about tefillah, very passionate about expanding people's awareness and appreciation for tefillah. As Chatani Maskir Hayom, I, Moshe Kurtz, could do a better job at emphasizing tefillah within my own discourse. So me, Moshe Kurtz, sitting in the pews on Yom Noraim, I have a hard time appreciating these piyutim. And I almost wonder sometimes if there is they're there to enhance the davening, but do we get to a point of diminishing returns in which we just make it longer and longer and longer that I'm not even able to focus on what the essence of the davening is? Forget just Chazaras HaShatz, but now we've taken Chazaras HaShatz and we've even expanded it beyond what Chazal originally dictated.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you're aware that I think at least once or twice I was at YU for the Yom Noraim, and they say every piyut pretty much because Rav Soloveitchik felt like, again, you talk about it culturally, Rav Soloveitchik felt like once you allow people to start playing around with the machzor or the siddur, okay, we'll take out piyutim because they're not so essential. Well, what goes next? So they sort of, his thing was, okay, we're going to say every single piyut, even though I suspect that personally, maybe even where he had davened, maybe they weren't even all there. I don't know, but either way, it's sort of, where is it coming from? Right, and that's the thing. If you ask me, I'm certainly not into, they have these machzorim with the extra piyutim, and I'm certainly one of those people. I'm not, if it's not one of the really beautiful or meaningful or nice to sing piyutim, where it says some congregations say, I'm not disappointed myself to not say every single one. I definitely think there is, for one of the reasons I think where people struggle with davening is just a lack of familiarity of Hebrew. And then you throw in the fact that it's not only in Hebrew, but it's also poetic, like slichos, like kinos. I think these are things that are very hard for people to appreciate, right? So it's an interesting argument. If you made it today, if we get rid of this, you won't be yotze the piyutim. I don't think any people would say, oh, okay, well, I don't want to risk that. I mean, I think people would be willing to lose being yotze, whatever the piyutim. But I guess maybe in Germany that was an additional argument that would maybe matter to people.
And what I would say is it's so fascinating how piyutim for many, especially on the Yom Noraim and high holidays, have become almost more emblematic and more important in some people's minds than the actual ikr of what one is chayiv to daven. I'll give you an example. So just I brought up one time at some kind of meeting at the shul, or it was during a shir. I gave a shir on piyutim and the Sfardim, Ashkenazim, debates about hefsek, etc. And I said, I don't think it'd be the worst thing if if for some minyanim, if they felt they didn't want to do piyutim, I don't think it'd be the worst thing. And then I had all these congregants, people listening to the shir, like, yeah, this is a great idea. Let's get rid of the piyutim. And I said, I just want to mention, Nisana Tokef also happens to be a piyut. Like, remove a Nisana Tokef from davening? How can you do that? Well, I said, look, if you're categorically against piyutim, you got to be consistent. So, right. So how do you start playing around like that? One could make the argument, I think, that maybe they were put in there initially with the understanding that it could be shifted around, though that's not so clear. I believe the Rama and other Ashkenazic poskim, they defended the integrity of the piyutim. So, okay, that's an important point. So this is all within the halachic formalism section. Minhag, hefsek, piyutim. So, but you mentioned that in the next paragraph, he then segues. He said, okay, now that I've established from a halachic standpoint why we can't play around and just simply revoke Chazaras HaShatz due to convenience, what is his more ethical argument that he makes to defend it?
Right, so that thing, he uses a lot. He says, okay, that's fine. I've given you all the things, but you want to talk about this? Let's talk about this, openly and honestly and intellectually. And he starts off with talking about what tefillah is. He talks about, as we know in the Gemara and Brachos, he talks so much about everything we learn from tefillah's chana. And he says, essentially, tefillah is v'chana hi medaberes al liba v'kola lo yishama. Right? She's speaking on her heart, in her heart, and her voice is not heard. And he says that tefillah is, he goes on, he says, right? Anyone who really wants to pour out their soul before Hashem with kavana, in order to do this, it's this personal, private, quiet thing where you pour out your heart before Hashem. He's sort of putting on he's putting it right there on the table. Let's remember what tefillah is. And I think this is such an important reminder for us, because I know for myself, sometimes I get stuck on, I want to make sure I say every word in the siddur. But to what degree am I investing in it? To what degree am I really, I say this to my students all the time. Davening is not reading words. It's not saying something. It's not reading from a book. It is pouring out your heart to God. And sort of if you say every word and you lack that, it's almost ikar chazar min hasefer. You've really just lost the essential act. You may have said every word, but it's like you haven't started to daven yet.
Right. The words are to bring you to this certain mental state and connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you're saying. So if you're just, Rabbi J.J. Schachter, he would say, okay, guys, let's daven. We got to daven up the source sheet over here. And then he would, Tochidei Dibor make a remark saying, obviously, I don't mean that davening is about just reading it up, but I always get a kick out of that phraseology that he would joke about, because people read it, I was going to say like they're laning, but maybe laning shouldn't be like that either. So that's not a good analogy either. Okay, so you're saying, and right, what the line that really spoke to me in that section is that he says, so even if there's people among us who aren't ready to have that level of kavana during davening, just because you might not have kavana doesn't mean we should tear down the entire institution and minimize davening to the point that your neighbor, that your fellow congregant won't have the opportunity to have kavanah either. So
yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting. I was listening earlier this year to a podcast with Dovid Weinberger, and he said something which I think would be very surprising. I don't know him well. He's on the staff at Wright. He's very Hasidic, neo-Hasidic. I don't like that term, but whatever, however you want to define him. And he was it was actually, I think it was an internal podcast, if I'm not mistaken, from within the yeshiva itself. Wright has a podcast. And he said something very interesting. He says the person in their lifetime, how many real tefillos do they have like this? And he suggested, I think the number he said maybe, I think was 7. And it's interesting. You would think, if you're the Hasidic type, every single day you're done. No, I think there's a real recognition that for all of us, that sometimes I finish the Shemona Esrei and I said every single word and I didn't think about God once. But there's a difference between saying, okay, that happens to me too often. I'm even comfortable with that happening to me. Just saying, and I'm okay that never will change. I'm never, right? There's never going to be a moment. There's never going to be a war, going on in Israel. There's never going to be a sick parent, a sick child, whatever it's going to be, where I'm going to want to pour my heart out to God. That's what he's saying. Okay, you'll tell me 99% of the time you don't get it. Fine. But to do what you're suggesting and to get rid of it is to be oker that possibility. And I think there's something really, really deep in that. Is he's not pretending that his balabatim are what they're not, or that the people, everybody has a meaningful tefillah, or that most of the time it is. But he's saying, and this is what was Dovid's point on this. He said those few tefillos where they're real, where you're really standing there, and where you really forget, you really, it's almost like there's this like bittul taking place, and you're just, that's everything. It's interesting. Rabbi Avram Shulman, who's a Rabbi at MTA, he's also a shul Rav in Pesach. He spoke about that growing up. I won't mention the community, and just for the, not to be controversial, I won't even mention who the Rav was who he saw. But he was growing up in a modern Orthodox shul where everyone davened these like very short Shemona Esreis. And one time they had a guest there, a very famous and controversial guest, and he said he just davened this long Shemona Esrei. It was the first time he ever understood there was this idea of really doing more than just sort of, as you said, davening up the Shemona Esrei. And it sort of opened up for him the possibility that it could be something more than that. And that's what Dovid Tzvi Hoffman seems to be saying here, is that even if you're a person who doesn't connect to it at all and you rush through it and you'd be fine to just be Yotze, someone else saying it, if you shut this off, you're never going to have a possibility of the real davening experience.
Right. And your articulation resonates with me a lot, making sure that we have the potential that on that day that I need to have that kavanah, I'm not going to be shortchanged by, by a, what do you call it, the matzah minyanim. So I guess I want to just push back a little bit and get your thoughts on this. There is a halakhic concept. It's a real halakhic concept with halakhic ramifications of tirchut tzibura, which is really imposing on the congregation's time. So I guess I wonder, on the one hand, we want to keep davening long enough and have enough content in there that those who need to have kavanah will be able to have as much kavanah as they want. But I almost feel like there is this fallacy out there that the only place one could daven is at minyan. Now, obviously, our davening's elevated through minyan, especially if one doesn't have kavanah. Then minyan is especially good for you because your tefillos will make it into shemayim without having the best kavanah because you're with a minyan. But I almost wonder if someone really wants to have a whole hisbodedus session and someone really wants to daven Shemona Esrei for an hour, they can't really complain that the minyan is moving faster than they are, because it's not like it's usher to daven the rest of the day. We daven 3 times a day, Shachris, Mincha, Ma'ariv, but that's just the baseline. You can choose any other time of day you want to talk to Hashem. So I wonder if there needs to be some kind of balance here at the same time. And I guess where you draw the line is really the question.
So that's the thing, it's interesting. I was talking to a Rav of a very well-known modern Orthodox shul, and I was, the truth is I grew up in a young Israel where, davening started at 8:45, which meant that I got there about 9:15, and it still went, till about 11:30. And there are many non-Orthodox shuls that go, solidly till 3 hours at least. And I said to my friend, I can't daven in those places. I mean, to me, I want, Shabbos morning, I want a 2-hour Chazaras. but not by cutting out on davening. By cutting, there's just so much downtime and wasted time and schlepping. That's where I think you can do it. And the truth is, I think he gives a little musser here. I mean, really, this is later on towards the end. He says that. He says at the end, what are we going to gain by this hischadshus? Chamesh ad eser dakos, 5 to 10 minutes. And look, if we were dealing, if someone was coming and saying, look, I'm a Baal Musser and I have my entire day mapped out, and if you give me 5 to 10 minutes, it will give me more time to either to help at home or to learn Torah or whatever it is that I do. But I can't help but feel the people who want, davening to be shorter, on Sunday, not only watch, both NFL games that are on, but watch the pregame and the post game and the post game. It's people who are, I'm not someone to talk about Bittelsman. I waste far too much time, but at least I'm honest and I don't pretend that I'm someone who every minute of my time is used well. That that's that's what he's saying. If you say, okay, I'm going to make davening, an hour shorter, and these 5 to 10 minutes that you're going to gain by cutting this out. Really, is
be on the couch playing Call of Duty or something, right? So your point that resonates with me a lot, and to any congregants who are listening to this, close your ears. So I find I run the 8 a.m. minyan at our shul, which is you can go over 2 hours. Otherwise, chokvel yavor, yaharigval yavor. To get misas based in, if you go over 2 hours on a typical Shabbos. I find that there is a strong correlation between the people who really want to get out as fast as possible and the people who don't stay for the shir following Kiddush after the minyan. And I find it a strong correlation between the people who do stay for the shir who aren't trying to move along davening as much. So I happen to be someone who doesn't like a very long davening. I've found, Torah material to read at times where it's hopefully dubiously mutter to do so. But I think your point's very well taken, which is how many of us who are complaining about how long davening takes are really then going on to learn in the base medrash 3 hours afterwards, or to acts of Kamilas Chasanman are actually that meticulous about maximizing our time to the extent that we have a legitimate taina, a legitimate claim that davening is taking 5 to 10 minutes too long for us.
Yeah, exactly.
100%. One point I just wanted to raise. We're doing some Yeshayahu Leibovich at my shul right now in our book club. We try to diversify our portfolio of different people. Don't worry, this won't be super controversial as far as Leibovich goes. But in his in the first chapter, this is a very lovely book. I have his Shilos and Shuvos also, but I can't see with the blur over here. But Eliezer Goldman put out a book summarizing or translating some of his essays. So when he's talking about prayer, he makes this argument. He says, everyone is capable of reciting verses of praise when in good spirits. To utter many halukas when one finds no joy in nature or in life is the act of the truly religious person, committed to prayer and printed with the stamp of the sages. So what he's getting at over there basically is that I feel sometimes that on the one hand, we want to encourage kavanah, and I see many rabbanim will get up there at the pulpit or in some other context, and they'll say, Rabbi said we have to have more kavanah and tefillah, there's this going on in Klal Yisrael, and that's all true and well taken. But I feel like sometimes we don't appreciate the people who they're not the way they're wired is that they're just not as easily inclined to having kavanah and to be able to concentrate well during davening. And yet they come anyway because they know that minyan is a value, and arguably for men, it's an obligation. I think there's almost, we don't always, I'm speaking broadly, not you. I'm saying broadly speaking, I feel like we don't give enough appreciation and credit to those who don't naturally connect to davening and have a hard time with it. And they come anyway because they know it's the right thing to do, because that's the Ratzon Hashem.
So I definitely agree with that. I think Jeffrey Fox essay on Facebook, I think had a post about this, the difference between people who are into davening and people who are, or makbid on minyan, and it's not necessarily, so much of an overlapping group as much as you would think. And I remember years ago, there was this sort of, I think it was a poem, maybe someone wrote about the about how they used to sort of look at the old men who sort of mumbled through davening and looked negatively, but then they came to have a respect for them. I don't deny any of that. I think that I certainly think that davening. I always tell my students, davening is hard. Anyone who tells you it's not is lying to you. It's not. It is. It's avoda. It's something that you have to work at. And I definitely think there's an appreciation for someone who is willing to keep on showing up even when they're not getting so much return, or so much bang for their buck. Where I would sort of push back though is, do we just say, okay, that's it, that's who they are, or do we try to educate or expand? And I would say, particularly in the world of modern orthodoxy, I think that, I mean, I don't think this is actually true where I work, so I think I can say this. I think a lot of modern Orthodox educators have a hard time with davening. And I think that we, it's very easy to get on your high horse about your Talmidim who are not davening. But if you look around the room many times in schools, you see teachers whispering to each other during Chazaras HaShatz, taking attendance, responding to emails on their phones. I think one of the places where I think modern Orthodoxy could, and I would think has to do much better, is to being more than just a text intellectual religion. And that's you don't get any more intellectual than Dovid Tzvi Hoffman. I mean, he was addressing a lot of the big academic questions. He wrote about the origins of the Mishnah, and he dealt with biblical criticism in German. I mean, this is not some touchy feely, happy clappy type. And yet he's the same one who is capable of, of really existing in that world of academia and the world of the intellect, is someone who's saying davening is this intimate pouring out of the heart. And I think that to the degree that modern Orthodoxy in many places continues to be intellect only and just about, texts very coldly learned without any sort of bigger thing, I think that's where we fail. I mean, I think that's why many places are bringing in, people like, my Rabbi, Reb Dov Zinger, trying to work on these things. And what I love about his approach is it doesn't start off with, oh, the congregants, they should do better, or the students, they should do better, right? He said when they wanted to work on why davening wasn't going the right way in his school, he said for a year they had meetings with just the Rebbeim. Where do we struggle with our davening? And only then, when they sort of talked about that and recognized the challenges, after a year, then they were ready to talk about, well, what can we do for the Talmidim? And I think that's the thing. I think, those of us in Chinuch or Rabbanis, as in your case, it's very easy to say, oh, the Balabatim, the Talmidim. But what do we do ourselves? And this morning with one of my other Rabbi, we were talking about, it's interesting, we're so into learning the words of Chazal, Mishnah, Gemara. The Siddur is a big part of, that's also, it's not a text that was put together at once, but if you want to understand davening, if you want to understand a lot of hashkafa, the Siddur is a really good place, to start. And yet instead, all we do is we turn it into a book where you have to mumble words. So I think there's a lot that can be said in that regard.
100%. And I would add one thing, which is just one more line from the Tshuva that really spoke to me, and I think speaks to the idea that you can't outsource your spirituality. He says, "Ulama yehi ha'ish ha'Yisraeli keparo asher lo yad l'spal ba'atzmo v'amar Moshe atir ba'adi." How can a Jewish person take Paro's philosophy? What is Paro's philosophy? I'm gonna outsource my conversation to Hashem. I'm gonna have Moshe Rabbeinu do it on my behalf. He'll intercede for me to God. But actually, we have the opportunity 3 times every day in Minyan, and then anytime personally, to communicate directly with the Melech Malachim Lachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so that's a very integral part of any Jewish person's spiritual life. And it's something that we can't just put on the side. We can't disregard it. And your point's very well taken, that Rav Dovid Tzvi Hoffman himself, he has the street cred to say it. He's very intellectual. He's very learned and very academic. And still, he's the one who's saying we can't just disregard and underrate the importance and centrality of prayer, of tefillah, within the Jewish person's life. And I think that's a really important lesson. Rabbi Sommer, with our 1 to 2 minutes left, I want to just ask you if there's any concluding thoughts you want to share on tefillah? I know you have so much to say about it, so I'll also ask, because I know you have so much to share and we are constrained to time, maybe you could let our listeners know where they can learn more of your Torah ideas also.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that line was very powerful to me as well. It's really, I mean, we're coming on, we're not too far from Shmos with the parashos of Paro, and it's sort of saying, to be a Jew is to not outsource your religion, and I think particularly in a day and an age where we can outsource everything, where we have someone doing our taxes and almost, and where we have people do anything we don't want to do. We can find someone, we can pay someone to drive carpool, and we can pay someone to anything we don't like. And I think to turn davening into something like that, okay, we have a chazan in the shul, like his job is to daven, and I'm just sort of, I'll sit on the side, and he says, maybe, right? Are you really going to listen? Are you really going to answer amen and listen to every bracha? I mean, that's the thing. If you, it's like we wouldn't talk through Kiddush on Friday night. How many people he says are going to get through, the repetition Shemona Esrei and actually be, listening to every word in order to be Yotzei. That's I think this is, it's one of the things. It's one of the reasons why all those years ago I fell in love with Melamed L'Hoil. When I was in Kol, it's so real. He's so deeply real. He's living again, in these very challenging times, being asked these very real tshuvos, and he manages to be in a lot of different worlds at the same time. He's not someone who's sort of in the ivory tower who doesn't understand what's going on out there. I think this is just such a powerful tshuva. It's one of the things why Chazaras and tshuvas. I love this project that you're doing that speaks to me, is because it really does, when they're done well, it shows halacha as this living organism, is this something which is just where it's not just you look something up in a book, but as we said, if this conversation was happening in a different time, in a different place where there weren't these mechadshim, it might be a different discussion. And as you said, I mean, this is something I'm very passionate about, not because I'm a great davener, but because I care about davening. I care about my relationship with Hashem. I do put a lot, as I think we initially met through Facebook. I do put a lot just on my Facebook page. I always tell my students that you can use social media. It's not just TikTok, but you can actually, there's a lot of Torah content out there. I've met a lot of wonderful, B'nai and Benos Torah through it. Real Talmidei Chachamim. So you can certainly find me over there. Email rabbipesach@gmail.com. And I do have my, I think you, at one point you said, going out on the, what did you call it, on the podcast circuit? I mean, I've been on a few different podcasts. This is the first one where I've gotten to sort of talk a little bit about halacha and things like that. So I really appreciate that opportunity. But anyone who wants to be in touch, I would welcome the opportunity.
And it's our huge schus to have you here on the podcast and to talk halacha and to talk hashkaf and talk tefillah with us, right? Pesach Sommer, thank you so much for your insights, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give you continued hatzlacha in all the amazing things you're doing for educating the next generation.
Thank you so much, Robert.